Probably the second most important person here tonight, my mom, Carol Paul. We have a lot of other family members here tonight, so I'm going to introduce them all. We've got my niece, Linda Paul. My daughter, Catherine Paul. My son, Robert Paul. My wife, Monica. My Aunt Debbie Paul, and my cousin, like a brother to me, Michael Paul. Now, I don't do a lot of campaigning, but occasionally I go out and do some speeches for my dad, and I've done this before, so if you've heard this before, it's going to be a repeat. Sorry. I first did this speech in Oklahoma City, and I started with, I've got two really, really good brothers. My oldest brother is Ronnie, and he got married first. Ronnie's got college buddies, and he's got high school buddies. He's got two really good brothers. But when he chose his best man for his wedding, the best man was Ron Paul. So when my brother Rand got married, from high school, he had friends from college, he had friends from medical school. He had two really good brothers. But the best man was Ron Paul. And then I got married the week after I graduated from medical school, and I had some great buddies from medical school. I had some great buddies from college. I had some really, really, really good buddies from high school. I had two really, really good brothers. But by far, the best man is Ron Paul.
Are there 5,000 Ron Paul supporters in Texas? I thought
so. We are proud to present the man, the myth, the legend, Dr. Ron Paul.
the revolution is alive and well in Texas. Thank you for that very nice welcome. I want to thank Stacy and Amanda for the introduction. I want to thank my family for being here and my son Robert for giving us a very nice introduction, and Jeremy tipping you off about the details of how you win elections and get delegates. That's pretty important. But it looks to me like freedom is still very popular, and I'm glad of that. You know, I think one of the candidates, I can't remember his name, but I think he dropped out of the race yesterday. Day, I was asked quite frequently by the media, what does that mean? I said, well, there were 12 at one time, we're down to 3. It looks like we're cutting the field down. And then they call up and they say, when are you going to quit? And I said, I thought we were just getting started. We have a country to change. We need to change what's going on in this country. We might as well wait. We might as well get our balanced budget before we quit this kind of stuff. There's a lot of enthusiasm, and I welcome the enthusiasm and the encouragement, because there were a few years when I would go around the country talking about the same issues, and the crowds were a little smaller and they were always polite. But the crowds now, people, when they ask about when are you going to drop out, I said, well, when nobody wants to support the cause of liberty. I said, in our case, we don't have a $4 million deficit in our campaign. Our numbers are growing. And the money's coming in, so I take that as a stamp of approval that there's a lot of people who care about freedom, and freedom is still popular. That we will keep going until we have victory. Enthusiasm and so much support from the young people. You know, there was one time in the 1960s they used to talk about the young people. They would say that if you were 20 years old and you weren't a liberal, you didn't have a heart. But they also said that if you were 40 and you didn't, and if you weren't a conservative, you didn't have a brain. But I say, why can't you have both and believe in freedom and the Constitution? Going on, especially here in the last several years. Things have changed quietly and steadily in a positive way. Although over the last 100 years it's been pretty much downhill for the cause of the Republic. We have undermined our Republic. But in the last 4 years, something dramatic has happened. There was a campaign 4 years ago. There was a lot of people paying attention. There was a lot of interest. But all of a sudden, something happened. Many of the things that we have been talking about and warning about, especially the Austrian economists, talking about, the danger of printing money and running up debts and doing all these things, and what would happen, we'd have a financial crisis and watch out for the housing bubble. When that came about, all of a sudden the people started saying, that's what these Austrian free market economists have been talking about. Let's talk more to them, and this is what's happening. The people are paying attention. Who would have ever dreamed that 5 or 10 years ago that we would ever make the Federal Reserve an issue in a presidential campaign? Just win the election and we'll win the Fed. Actually, next year year would be an appropriate year. The Fed's been around for nearly 100 years, 1913, and they've destroyed 98% of the value of the 1913 dollar. So let's not let them do the 2% left. Let's have next year, let's have a bill to repeal the Federal Reserve Act as a celebration. It has impressed me very much going to the college campuses and talking to people, how many people now understand exactly what the monetary issue is all about. And they understand by looking at a little bit of history and why the founders warned us about the money issue and why they put into the Constitution that the government, the Congress could not print money. They could only use gold and silver as legal tender. And that's what they should do. Only gold and silver. But of course, we didn't follow those rules, and by the fact that the Federal Reserve can print money and create money at will, and they buy up debt, what do the politicians do when they can accommodate the big spenders? They spend a lot of money, they run up the debt, they tax to the maximum, they borrow to the maximum, then they still don't have enough, and they have this ravenous appetite for big government. So then the Federal Reserve comes in and accommodates the big spenders, and they just print the money, and lo and behold, it destroys the value of the money. Now, some people say that's difficult to understand, but you know, more and more I talk to people in 8th and 9th grade in high school, and they say that's just common sense. You print a lot of money, it's going to lose its value. It's also the mischief that occurs. Government spending money is one issue, but there's two problems. One, they take the money from us. They may take it directly through taxation. They may put the burden on a later generation by borrowing, but they might just print the money. So it's always a burden by taking it out of the economy, and undermines our productivity in the economy and to be able to produce wealth. But doing that is one thing, but the other half, what we really get punished is when they spend the money. I mean, what good do they turn on when they're spending all this money? They might feel compelled to go start a war that we don't need and get us into trouble that we don't need. That's been a big problem. And matter of fact, the problem as I see it, whether it's the financial, whether it's the foreign policy, or whether it's an attack on our civil liberties, what we have lost here in the last 70 or 80 years is a respect for our Constitution, a respect for our rule of law. By allowing our representatives and our presidents to ignore the Constitution, if we get into trouble, why wouldn't the solution be only sending people to Washington who read the Constitution, understand this, and lives up to their oath of office? Simply, that means that we wouldn't have a Federal Reserve System because it's not authorized under the Constitution, and it destroys the value of our money. But what about the war issue? Just think of how many wars we've been in since World War II. None of them have been declared. None of them have been won. How many trillions of dollars of wealth has been consumed? How long do we stay in the country and not wake up and say, enough is enough? Well, right now, the American people have awakened. Not only are they looking at the Federal Reserve, but they're saying, we've been in Afghanistan long enough, and it's time to come out. Defense of one's country is proper and necessary, and the President has a responsibility to be Commander-in-Chief. But the President of the United States does not have the authority to start wars without the proper permission coming from the Congress. Even today, we have a his Secretary of Defense over to the Hill, and Secretary Panetta explained that we don't have to do that. We don't have to get permission. We can get legal permission from the United Nations. And of course, this is how we've gotten ourselves into way too much trouble. But great nations generally are not destroyed by military means. We did not, fortunately, we did not have to have a nuclear exchange with the Soviet Union. I was drafted in 1962. There were I served 5 years in the military. But, you know, even under those circumstances of how dangerous it was, you know, at least our president at that time called up Khrushchev and said, maybe we ought to talk this out. And there was an agreement. They take their missiles out of Cuba, and we took our missiles out of Turkey, and we didn't have to fight and kill each other and have a nuclear war. Is, why can't we talk to a country that doesn't even have a nuclear weapon and we can't have people building a nuclear weapon? This is what the founders advised. In order to get along in the world, you should offer friendship and trade. The more you trade with a country, the less likely it will be that we will fight. And this is what we should be doing. Just think how much better off we're doing with Vietnam. How many people did we lose? 60,000 and hundreds of thousands, if not 1 million Vietnamese died. The French were there for 10 years. All that effort to tell the Vietnamese what they should do with their government out of fear that they might the whole country go communist. Well, what happened? We lost the war, we left, they didn't go communist, they're trading partners that are ours, they've been westernized, we invest over there, they invest over here. Just think of what was achieved in peace that couldn't be achieved with war. And there's explicit ways to go to war. We should never accept the principle of preemptive war. Preemptive war means we start it. We don't have a right to start wars. We have an obligation to make our country safe and secure and have a national defense, but you don't do that by using war as the weapon. We've been taught for too long in our colleges, and the status quo, the conventional wisdom is that war can get you out of a depression or a bad recession. That is exactly right. It isn't right, it's wrong. Even if it did do that, it never justifies that type of killing, but it doesn't work. Wars are always an economic cost to society. To the Constitution for the decision making when you go to war, but also to the Christian just war principle. If we follow those, we believe that there would be a lot less fighting and killing in the world, we would be much richer. In the last 10 years, we have accumulated $4 trillion worth of debt due to the wars that we're fighting. Think how far that money could have gone in society here. How much better off we would be. We wouldn't be so much in debt. Today we are a poor nation. We have the greatest debt in the history of the world, and both foreign and domestic. And it is the foreign policy that brings people down so often. It isn't the wars that finally eliminate a whole empire. The Soviets went down not because we had to have that war, but because they finally went bankrupt and they had to go home. And this is today our greatest threat. The one thing I can assure you of, with my experience in the service and my experience in Washington, and knowing a little bit about our military power, we do not have to worry about anybody touching us militarily. We have the strongest military. That much confidence about we have nothing to worry about, because when we take an oath in the office, we take an oath to defend against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Well, I'm more worried right now about the domestic problems we have. Think of how our civil liberties have been undermined in these past 10 years. And it has been feared. Some of it you can understand it, but it doesn't justify it. And we have accepted this notion in this last decade that it's okay to sacrifice some of our liberties to be safe. That is correct. It is never necessary to sacrifice liberty for the safety. And the founder said, if you do, you're not going to be safe, and you will lose everything. You will not, and you'll lose your liberties as well. And that is what happened. So immediately after 9/11. Within a week or two, we passed this thing called the Patriot Act. Now, I know personally some members of Congress that voted for the Patriot Act because they said it sounded good. I argued with one member on the day he was voting for it, and I said, why are you voting for this? You haven't even had time to read it. This just came up an hour ago. He said, well, I know. I said, you know, there's some bad stuff in this bill. He says, I know. And I said, why are you going to vote for it? He said, well, I just can't go home and explain to my constituents under these conditions why I voted against the Patriot Act. I said, well, that's your job. Go home and explain it to them. Called repeal the Fourth Amendment Act, maybe a lot of those people would have voted for it. So next year we'll also put on the list the repeal of the Patriot Act and get you. We'll call that bill to destroy the Fourth Amendment Act and maybe more people will vote for it under those conditions. But our liberties are being systematically undermined. With the Patriot Act, we've essentially lost our privacy, and it has been eroding for a long time, but it is essentially gone. It also gives the authority to this agency of government, which I hope is not a friend of yours because it's not a friend of mine, and that's TSA at the airport. You know, actually, the purpose of the members of Congress and the President isn't to make us safe. The Second Amendment is supposed to make us safe. But the purpose, the oath of office is, we don't take an oath to, an allegiance to our political parties, or that we provide safety above all efforts and ignore liberty. The oath of office says, obey the law and obey the Constitution. Is what the oath of office says. There's been a bit of an uproar just in the last couple of weeks, and justified to a large degree, about the President lecturing the Supreme Court on what they should do with Obamacare. And I think the easiest answer there is repeal the whole thing. That the President interfering and trying to lecture the Supreme Court, I wasn't as annoyed about that as some other things. What about the President declaring unilaterally by executive order that he can be the prosecutor, that he can be the judge and the jury in the execution? And the law of the land says that the President can make the decision to assassinate an American citizen. What we see at the airports when we look at those pictures and all those x-rays, if we're not annoyed enough by the military being able to arrest us, or the American to decide who can be assassinated, I tell you what, we're not deserving of very much, but I'll give you some good news. The people in this country aren't going to put up with it, and they're changing their minds. Monetary policy, a civil liberties, or a foreign policy. I think about the individual liberties, the importance of individuals. And I think that's what made America great. It was the individual. The Declaration of Independence is very clear about where our lives and our liberties come from. They come from our Creator, and they're not from our government. Understood what the consequence would that be, and that is if you have a right to your life and a right to your liberty and an obligation to take care of yourself, you ought to have the right to keep the fruits of your labor. Just remember, it wasn't the founders that gave us the income tax. That came in the progressive era in 1913 along with the Federal Reserve. So we'll add that to the list too. Repeat all the 16. There's always an excuse, for all the laws. And this January 1st, we had 40,000 new laws placed on the books. And once again, I would really enjoy being the first president that eliminated 40,000 laws. The bureaucrats and the politicians believe it's for your own good. That's what their claim is. And I've had members that tell me on the House floor, I said, why are you voting for this? You're intruding on this personal decision making by the individual. He says, well, the people are too dumb. And they sincerely believe it, but they do come along and they do it for your own good. And when that happens, if governments can believe that they can improve personal behavior by regulating you, believe me, we're in big trouble. And that's where we are. And that's why we have so many laws and regulations. And the courts now are so out of control as well as the executive branch. Think of all the regulations. They're not legal. The executive orders, almost all of those are illegal from the president. The president wrote an executive order. He took the Defense Production Act, which was written in 1950, and he renewed it, not to Congress. The president renewed it with an executive order. But he changed a few words. The emergency powers, which should never be granted if in case there's a war going on, the president can take over all of industry. But he changed the word. He changed the word. He says not only in time of war, but in time of peace, the president can do that as well. Simple solution on that. Let's have a constitutional president that understands that executive orders can be used in a very limited fashion, but one thing you could do is use the executive order to repeal all the executive orders that are illegal. What we're talking about, what we do, we'll say, oh, you guys want to go back to the Dark Ages. And but you know what the Dark Ages is big government and tyranny and tyrants and dictators and pharaohs and kings. That is old-fashioned. That's going back to the Dark Ages. What's going in the future is looking to a free society and improve upon it. We live in a very fortunate time in our history. We live and still enjoy the blessings of liberty. But the big question is, how long are they going to last? They have been around. We live in one of the freest, probably the freest country ever and the wealthiest country ever. But in the last 75, 80 years, there has been a steady erosion. And just recently, it was recognized that now we aren't producing enough, it's difficult borrowing, it's difficult just printing money. And therefore, for the first time in our history, our middle class is shrinking. And it's getting poorer. And the people know about it. And they talk about, the 99 and the 1. And that's a mixed bag. And you have to be careful about that. Because in a way, I talk about it, but we shouldn't be resentful of people in the 1% or 2% or 3%. If they made an honest living without the government, they should be respected. Somebody's in that tax bracket, that income bracket, making millions, if not billions of dollars, and they do it because they get bailed out and they work the system, they get their contracts and special privileges. That shouldn't be tolerated. But this is what has happened, is that the powerful special interests have been benefiting by the pretense that we're helping poor people. The housing program is the best example of this of recent times, because it was designed to help poor people. Everybody deserves a house. Rights don't, you don't have a right to what you want or desire or demand. You have a right to your life and your liberty, but you don't have a right to somebody else's property, so you don't have a right. Because nothing is free, the government can't provide it, they have to steal it from somebody. That's fine for a while, as long as we're wealthy, as long as we can borrow, as long as they trust our money, but eventually it all changes, and that's what we're witnessing today. It's a change in attitude, because we know this can't continue, because we're living off the fact that people still trust our dollar around the world. But it's fast fading. There are plans being laid to have an alternative world currency, and this will be very damaging. And we can work on it, as so many of us have in this country, to restore the Constitution and sound money and commodity money. But the other side of this argument, they know exactly what we know, and guess what? They're planning on a worldwide currency. They're talking about the United Nations, the IMF, imposing a What we need is a restoration in the concept of liberty, the understanding, and the faith and confidence that it does work. And that is, I think, where we have come up short. We have lost our confidence in ourselves, and we have allowed this idea that we can become dependent on government. But now the productivity is gone way down, and we are a much poorer nation. But the one thing that is really bothersome in another way about when we become dependent on government and redistribution of wealth and all the special interests, that if people become dependent and it seems like, well, they're needy and we save them and we take care of them, actually when they get totally dependent on others, they lose their sense of worth. And I think this is what happens so often.
That's right.
What freedom is all about. For me, it's seeking excellence and virtue. That's what our personal responsibility is, whether it's in caring for ourselves and our family, if it's caring for our intellectual pursuits, if it's caring about our spiritual life. It is up to us. Our creative energy comes from liberty. When we lose our liberty, the government curtails us, we destroy that and destroy the sense of worth. And I think we're at that point today because there's a lot of anger out there, because right now they're fighting and screaming in the argument up in Washington. Why don't you guys get along together? Well, they got along together. They always compromise. One side wanted to spend money on one thing, the other side wanted on something else, and they compromise and spend on both until we're broke. So it isn't compromise we need. We need a definition of what truth and rightness is, and then bring people together on these issues. Because of freedom, everybody might come together for a different reason. Everybody is going to use their freedom in a different way, but we all should join in supporting freedom. We accept this all the time. We accept focus all the time on our religious values. Many people have different religious values, different churches, different beliefs. Some are atheists. But if we believe in freedom, we allow people to do that. It should be that way in social affairs. This concept of freedom divided into pieces. The founders had it together right. Personal liberty and social liberty and economic liberty was all the one and the same. They never talked about it. But now we have a group defends economic liberty to a degree, and they get sloppy with that. And then another group can say, well, we're going to protect civil liberties, and I'm a civil libertarian, and we're going to take care of that. But it's one and the same. And when you see this come about, it is not going to be a Republican revolution. It's not going to be a Democratic revolution. It's going to be a revolution of all the people coming together and saying, freedom is the issue. For those who say that this is going to the past and going backwards, know that it's only beginning. The understanding of liberty is only a couple hundred years of a real test. If they are the past, we are the future, as far as I'm concerned. But good things are happening in the country, and one is that people like you are very numerous and growing in numbers. They're all over the country. And the last week and continuing this week, we've been talking on the campuses and bringing people out, and we get usually these small crowds of 3,000, 4,000, up to 8,000 people. One day when we had a very nice rally, I think it was one of the very big ones in California, I anxiously looked at the internet the next morning, and in the article, the headline was, "Where's Ron Paul gone? Where is he?" Well, sometimes they would like to ignore us, but I think they're going to hear from us loud and clear. Quotation which I use a lot, and that is, an idea whose time has come can't be stopped by any army. Ideas are powerful and they have consequences. Bad ideas have bad consequences. We put up with a lot of bad ideas, and the 20th century was a bad century because there was a lot of fighting and killing needlessly. Yeah. We need a new century where we can talk more about peace and prosperity and the rule of law. That's what we need. So many are coming to this conclusion that these ideas are alive and well on the college campuses. But there's a lot of people who come now, and even the media is recognizing it's not only those teenagers and young college kids. There's a lot of people coming together. And a lot of people worry about it because if they take a vote and as they say, well, 51%, we don't have 51% to pursue these beliefs. The founders knew this and they understood it, and it's estimated that maybe 7 or 8% of the people really believed and understood what the revolution was all about and what freedom was all about. But today our number is even much better than that. And the numbers are growing, but as Benjamin Franklin said, Franklin said, that what you need is an irate, tireless minority spreading brush fires of freedom in the minds of men. That's what we need. So the good ideas are becoming pervasive. They've been around now for 30 years or so. I get a lot of credit, which I think is excessive because many more individuals have done so much hard work in the intellectual community. And it has to happen. Just as Keynesianism was an intellectual revolution and brought us havoc for 100 years, but even in the 20s and early 30s, the persistence was, yes, we still believe in free enterprise and the gold standard and all this. But behind the scenes, the intellectual community was saying, no, it's fascism and communism and socialism and interventionism and welfarism and inflationism and central banks, and they won the day. But they're losing now because their system is obviously failing and the people know it. Change our policies. We need to change the spending. I'm for cutting a lot of spending, as I said. But you know, even under those conditions, I still have priorities. If we work our way out of it, we could have priorities and try to take care of those who have been taught to be so dependent. You don't need to start on food stamps. I think you should start on all the foreign spending. Absolute necessity to go about the world spreading our goodness. They call it spreading our exceptionalism. And this has been going on since Woodrow Wilson, make the world safe for democracy. Some people have named this neo-Jacobinism, this idea that we can force people to be good. Well, I'll tell you what, we have been an exceptional nation. We at one time understood property rights and monetary policy and contract rights, limited government, and yet today we have lost that. But if you are an exceptional nation, if we are to be an exceptional nation, people will want to emulate us. They'll want to copy us. You can't go overseas and do this, or if you do it, we'll give you money. If you don't do it, we'll bomb you. That's not the way to change the world. So often the argument is used against legalizing freedom of choice in society. When people hurt each other and damage each other, obviously that's the purpose of government, to take care of those problems. But when people spend their money in a way that you don't approve or have a lifestyle that you don't approve of, and you say the government has to come in and change it, then all of a sudden, what we do is we just get into more and more trouble. And people will say, well, I can't allow people to spend their money. They might not do it wisely. I can't allow them to do this. They might become a gambler. It'll be all my fault because I allowed them to do this. But by legalizing something and legalizing freedom of choice, you don't endorse it. Because people use their religion in a way you don't want to. You don't endorse their religion. So I think probably the most important thing for me personally is thinking about striving for excellence and virtue and dealing with spiritual life. And that should be in the business of government. And under those conditions, though, government should just stay out of it. Spiritual life and our intellectual life, why is it that we automatically say we need the FDA to tell us everything we ever do about putting what we a long time about the war on drugs. I think the war on drugs has been a total I think they're a mess, but I also know that drug addiction of prescription drugs is a lot worse than illegal drugs. I also know that addiction shouldn't be a crime, and we shouldn't throw people in prison that didn't commit a violent crime. Our country tried Prohibition back when they passed the 18th Amendment. And, you know, just think of the difference in that period of time. They actually amended the Constitution to change this and give the power to the government. Today, the government just doesn't never think about it. But that was a total failure, so people woke up and said we had to repeal the Prohibition. And today, though, I think we're making great progress. When you see Pat Robertson coming out and saying, "Hey, let's look at this more carefully," and he, like I, is very reserved about saying drugs are dangerous, but there's a lot of danger. Who's responsible for protecting you against yourself? When the government thinks they can do that, they'll regulate every single thing you do. They'll but it's also one of the excuses for the violation of our civil liberties. And guess what? Guess who some of the organized efforts are against the changing the drug laws? Alcohol companies. They don't want people using something in place of alcohol. Also the drug companies. What if you started using something that you could grow in your backyard? You didn't buy all those expensive drugs. The issue for me is liberty, and who makes the decision? Because one thing leads to another. Today, if you decided you wanted to drink raw milk, you might be prohibited by the federal government. Now, just because there's such a poor understanding of the war on drugs, there was a product, a commercial product that we had for years. The founders grew it in their backyards and in their fields. And we used it in World War II. But because of the war on drugs, they prohibit this country from growing hemp. One of their excuses is, well, it looks like marijuana. They say they better not do it. I said, yeah, but if somebody wanted to get high on hemp, they'd have to smoke a cigar as big as a phone pole. But once again, it's back to our commons. Who's going to make up our minds? But you know, all this freedom doesn't work, though, unless we do one thing. We have to assume responsibility for ourselves. If we assume just like in economics, the government's always the lender of last resort, and they bail out the big guys. If the government is always the protector of last resort, if you do something that makes no sense and you do harm to yourself, you shouldn't be able to come and coerce your neighbor to take care of you. So freedom does imply responsibility. John Adams argued the case that if we became a less moral society, an immoral society cannot have liberty because they abuse it. And in many ways, I think this is what's been happening to us. I think a lot about the abortion issue and the problems that we've had there. Well, the laws were, abortions were done in the 60s illegally. So the law wasn't changed. What happened is the attitude was changed and then the laws were changed. So the laws do reflect the people. So many of our problems is a reflection of, our moral behavior. And so there's a lot of responsibility on us as individuals. And assuming this responsibility is crucial. But to assume that the government is always going to be there for us to take care of us, it doesn't work. And the more the government is involved, they say, well, if you do such and such, that'll be a cost to government. Well, the government is nothing more than a thief in the night that comes and redistributes the wealth. The most important thing we do to carry on this revolution is to recognize that we live in dangerous time and recognize that there's a larger number than ever who now are joining in the freedom movement and believe in individual liberty, believe in the rule of law. Yes. And therefore, we have a responsibility. Individuals like you that would come out and listen to a talk like this are different than the average person. The average person is home doing something else, and then they may vote, and if they do vote, they might not ask whom they're going to vote for until the day before they vote. But individuals like you who become knowledgeable and understand the problems, I believe you have a great responsibility. You know, if you have your head in your sand, you can't get money. Knowledgeable, believe in it, and if you're prepared to understand what liberty is all about and you want to participate, people will ask me, what should I do? Where should I go? Well, if you're prepared and you have credible evidence that you're convinced, somebody will make use of your talents. And we all have different talents, we all have different responsibility, but if nothing else, we have responsibility for ourselves. Just think if everybody took care of themselves, what a wonderful place this world would be. And our neighbors and local governments permissible under the Constitution. We have responsibilities that in our churches. There's a lot that can be done, and there's so much goodness out there. So we really want a healthy economy where there are more rich people. Because what are they going to do with their money? They're going to help people. The money would be there. There would be a greater amount of wealth. But we have destroyed the wealth machine in this country. And I don't think there are very many people I know in Washington understand how serious it is. Because they think they can borrow and spend and print money. It's going to last forever. I think you know differently. I think you know how desperately we need a change. And I thank you very much for participating.